Picture a teenager at a kitchen table, working through her mother's prescription bottles one by one. Open the capsule. Empty the barbiturate powder. Pack it back with sugar. Seal it. Move to the next bottle. This wasn't punishment. This wasn't a chore assigned by a cruel parent. This was Lorna Luft attempting to keep Judy Garland alive. Or at least, buying enough time that the next crisis could be survived. Her father Sidney had developed the technique himself, diluting Garland's sleeping pills, reducing the concentration without touching the physical appearance of the capsules. Vanity Fair documented the practice in 2017. Sid Luft diluted the pills himself first, then eventually taught his teenage daughter to do the same. A Time magazine account described the rhythm of it. Once a week, sitting down together, emptying 3/4 of Judy's sleeping capsules and refilling them with sugar, working through the bottles methodically until every one looked exactly as it had before. Lorna later described the logic of it with the flat clarity of someone who had processed the strangeness into normalcy years earlier. When you have a parent who's teaching you how to take care of your other parent, that's what you do. 3 children were raised inside that household. Liza May Minnelli, born March 12, 1946, daughter of Judy and her second husband, MGM director Vincente Minnelli. Lorna Luft, born November 21, 1952, daughter of Judy and her third husband, Sidney Luft. And Joseph Joey Wiley Luft, born March 29, 1955, the youngest, the only son, and by a considerable distance, the quietest. Same mother, same household, same love, same chaos, same impossible inheritance. When Judy Garland died on June 22, 1969, at 47 years old, each of them took a completely different road through the wreckage. Understanding those 3 roads requires understanding the conditions that created them, which means understanding what had been done to their mother long before she became a mother at all. Frances Ethel Gumm was born in Grand Rapids, Minnesota on June 10, 1922. By the time MGM renamed her Judy Garland and signed her at 13 in 1935, the pharmaceutical dependency that would eventually define and destroy her was already well established. Gerald Clark's biography, Get Happy, The Life of Judy Garland, documents that her mother Ethel introduced her to both stimulants and sleeping pills before she was 10 years old, years before any studio doctor had anything to do with her. That is the documented origin point, not Hollywood, not Louis B. Mayer, not a casting couch or a predatory contract. Her own mother, in their family home, before the child had filmed a single frame. What MGM did was systematize what Ethel Gumm had started. The studio put the newly named Judy Garland on severe dietary restrictions: chicken soup, black coffee, and cigarettes, to maintain the slight frame that photographed correctly for leading roles. Studio doctors prescribed Benzedrine and amphetamines to keep her energized through 16-hour shooting days. When the stimulants kept her wired through the night, they prescribed Seconal and other barbiturates to force enough sleep before the morning call. By the time she finished filming The Wizard of Oz at 17 in 1939, she was dependent on both ends of the pharmaceutical cycle simultaneously. The arithmetic of it was pitiless. Amphetamines made natural sleep physiologically impossible, which made sedatives medically necessary, which made waking up without stimulants inconceivable, which required stronger stimulants, which required stronger sedatives. Her body had been recalibrated over years and by professionals into a machine that could only operate on pharmaceutical inputs. Garland described MGM's methods without any particular softening in interviews collected across her career. They'd give us pep pills. Then they'd take us to the studio hospital and knock us out cold with sleeping pills. Mickey Rooney sprawled out on one bed and me on another. Then after 4 hours, they'd wake us and give us the pep-up pills again so we could work 72 hours in a row. Half of the time we were hanging from the ceiling, but it was a way of life for us. A way of life. She offered it as explanation, not accusation. The arrangement had simply been the operating terms of her employment, and she had accepted them the way you accept weather. She also said, separately, that she'd been pretty much of a walking advertisement for sleeping pills for extended periods. The framing is clinical. The reality was that by 20, natural sleep was physiologically unavailable to her. Natural wakefulness was physiologically unavailable. Everything that looked like effortless performance in front of a camera was behind the camera, a pharmaceutical negotiation that her body required to function in any direction at all. The talent underneath all of this was genuinely, extraordinarily large. On April 23, 1961, Garland gave a concert at Carnegie Hall in New York that was being called the greatest night in show business history within months of its completion. The double album recorded that evening ran to 26 tracks, spent 73 weeks on the Billboard charts, and won the Grammy Award for Album of the Year, making Garland the first woman ever to receive that honor. A Star is Born, in 1954, had given audiences performances that critics still hold up among the finest in Hollywood history. Her CBS television program launched in 1963. She was, by every external measure available, a global icon at the apex of a 50-year career. The private reality had inverted almost completely. By the time she was in the final years of her life, she owed approximately $4 million in back taxes to the IRS. She had been reduced to performing in smaller venues for fees bearing no relationship to her stature. When she married her fifth husband, Mickey Deans, in a civil ceremony at Chelsea Registry in London on March 15, 1969, she was penniless. She had roughly 99 days left. She said, at different points in her career, that she'd spent her entire life trying to get over the rainbow. She wasn't being poetic about the song. She meant she'd spent decades trying to escape being reduced entirely to it, trying to be more than the 16-year-old in the blue gingham dress who had been drugged through filming and then told the image she projected in those scenes was the most valuable thing about her. She never entirely managed it. The 3 children she raised inside this contradiction knew both versions of her, not from a distance, not retrospectively, but simultaneously, from inside the house. Lorna Luft described growing up with Garland as a real double-edged sword. The highs were incredibly high. The lows were devastating. The warmth in that house was genuine. Judy Garland loved her children and expressed it in ways they clearly felt and retained for the rest of their lives. Liza later recalled her mother as someone who could be the funniest person in any room. Quick, specific, devastating comic timing that was the same instrument she used on stage, deployed at the kitchen table for an audience of 3. There were good years. Early childhood for the younger two, at the family's Rockingham house with their grandmother Luft often in attendance, held a kind of stability that the later years wouldn't. The whole family appeared together at the Palace Theater on Broadway in 1967, Judy and all 3 children on stage simultaneously, a rare public expression of something that was more often experienced backstage or in transit across time zones. Lorna's professional debut came even earlier than that Palace Theater appearance. In 1963, at 11 years old, she sang Santa Claus is Coming to Town on the Judy Garland show's CBS Christmas episode for her mother's national audience. She had been in the Carnegie Hall audience 2 years before that, in April 1961, watching her mother deliver what 2,800 people and several decades of retrospective criticism would identify as the greatest night in show business history. The Carnegie Hall concert was enormously loud and electrically charged, even by the standards of Garland's concerts, the audience responding to the first bars of songs before she'd finished singing them. the waves of sound filling the hall and coming back off the walls as something palpable. Afterward, family members had to be taken to a dressing room. The experience required its own recovery. Watching your mother do that, being that good, commanding a room that completely, is a specific kind of education with no curriculum attached to it. The structure of daily life at home was shot through with instability in ways that accumulated slowly enough to be normalized. Pill bottles turned up hidden in slippers, tucked behind books, stashed in the hems of dresses, distributed throughout the house so that wherever Garland was, something was within reach. The family moved constantly, following performance schedules and financial reversals that couldn't be predicted or controlled. Liza attended approximately 22 different schools growing up, a number that contains its own particular story about what childhood looks like when your primary anchor is also perpetually in motion, when the concept of home is wherever the current booking is, when sustained friendships are structurally impossible because the hotel changes every week. Liza became Garland's primary caretaker at age 13. She has described the role in interviews with a specificity that suggests she rehearsed the description over many years before finding words that fit. Nurse, doctor, pharmacologist, and psychiatrist rolled into one. She would place calls to physicians on her mother's behalf, request prescription refills, manage the practical logistics of Garland's chemical dependency as a parallel track to managing the performance schedule. At 13, a child building and maintaining her mother's pharmaceutical supply chain, while simultaneously rotating through her 13th or 14th school. Psychologists call this parentification, a chronic role reversal based on the parents' inability to manage their own care, and they document it as emotionally damaging in precisely the ways Liza's later life would confirm. Lorna had the specific weekly task. The time account describes the pill swapping as a routine. Sitting down beside her father, systematically working through Judy's bottles, reducing the barbiturate loads to something survivable without visibly changing the capsules, returning everything to its original position. The act required dexterity and patience, and the ability to do it without anyone knowing it had been done. Lorna described what she was told about why. When you have a parent who's teaching you how to take care of your other parent, that's what you do. The instruction was framed as care. It was care. It was also a child being handed a problem that no child should have been handed, by a parent who genuinely believed the assignment was protective. Joey occupied a different position in the household's internal structure. 3 years younger than Lorna, the work of managing Garland's chemical dependency had been distributed before he was old enough to be assigned a specific task. What he had instead was an environment in which crisis management was ambient and continuous, and never named as unusual. The background frequency of a household organized around the needs of someone who required management in order to be safely present. He was 10 years old when his parents' marriage ended in 1965. He was 12 for the Palace Theater appearance. He was 14 when everything changed permanently. The structural difference between the 3 children's origins matters to understanding their divergent paths. Vincente Minnelli was a director of the first rank, with his own prestigious independent career at MGM spanning over 2 decades. His major productions included Meet Me in St. Louis in 1944, An American in Paris in 1951, which won the Best Picture Oscar, The Bandwagon in 1953, and Gigi in 1958, for which he won the Academy Award for Best Director. He and Garland divorced in 1951, when Liza was 5, but he remained a stable presence in her life, financially secure, professionally celebrated, his identity and achievements entirely separate from anything Garland's name implied. He eventually left an estate of $1.1 million to Liza when he died in 1986. He represented Hollywood success in its most intact and sustainable form. Sidney Luft was a genuinely different structure. He managed Garland's career, arranged her comeback vehicle, A Star is Born, through a Warner Brothers deal in 1954 and stayed professionally and personally enmeshed in her life well past their 1965 divorce. The memoir he began writing about Judy in 1963 remained unfinished at his death in September 2005 and was published posthumously. The organizing project of his adult life was a book about someone else's life. He taught Lorna to swap the pills. Joey told People magazine years later, "My dad loved her. He wanted to protect her." Both things are true, and neither cancels the other. For Lorna and Joey, their second parent wasn't an alternative structure to the chaos. He was another person caught inside it, loving it and enabling it simultaneously, as people often do. June 22, 1969, was a Sunday in London. The city was quiet in the particular way of Sunday mornings in early summer, traffic thin, streets soft with light. At 4 Cadogan Lane in Chelsea, a small rented mews house that Judy and Mickey Deans had taken since their wedding 3 months earlier, Mickey Deans woke up sometime after dawn and found his wife's side of the bed empty. The bathroom door was locked or ajar. Sources differ on the detail. What doesn't differ is what he found when he got inside. She was sitting with her head slumped forward. She was already gone. The house itself was ordinary in every respect, except what happened inside it that morning. A small mews property in Chelsea, the kind of London address that implies comfortable circumstances while revealing nothing about the actual financial situation of its occupants. Garland had been essentially destitute when she arrived in England for a series of engagements. She had performed her last concert in Copenhagen weeks earlier. Her health had been deteriorating through the first months of 1969 in ways that were visible to people close to her. The marriage to Mickey Deans, conducted at Chelsea Registry on March 15th, was 99 days old. Coroner Gavin Thurston convened an inquest the following week and delivered his ruling on June 27th. The cause of death was an incautious self-overdosage of barbiturates. He was explicit about what the finding wasn't. The overdose was unintentional. The autopsy showed the drugs had been ingested over a prolonged period, rather than in a single, overwhelming dose. There was no stomach lining inflammation, no traces remaining in the stomach at time of examination, the pattern consistent with her long-standing dependency, rather than a deliberate act. The barbiturates that killed her on June 22, 1969, were the same pharmaceutical class that studio doctors and her own mother had first introduced into her body before she was a teenager. She had been dependent on them for more than 30 years. She was 47 years old. She had been born on June 10, 1922, and died 12 days after what would have been her 47th birthday. Liza was 23. Lorna was 16. Joey was 14. The news crossed the Atlantic the way news about icons does, immediately, loudly, before any individual on the receiving end has a chance to process it privately before the world weighs in. Within hours, tributes ran in every major newspaper. Radio stations played Over the Rainbow on continuous rotation. The cultural machinery for grieving a legend operates at a velocity completely mismatched with the speed at which 3 people absorbed the loss of their mother. The children were inside the industrial grief operation before the personal one had even started. The house at 4 Cadogan Lane was later demolished in 2015, which means the specific building where she died no longer exists. What remains is the address, the coroner's report, and the 3 people who were on the other side of the Atlantic that Sunday morning. On June 27, 1969, the Frank E. Campbell Funeral Home on Manhattan's Upper East Side received over 22,000 people who came to pay their respects to Judy Garland. The line stretched for blocks in both directions. All 3 children, Liza, Lorna, and Joey, entered the building together and moved through a space full of strangers who were also genuinely grieving, but had lost something fundamentally different from what the three of them had lost. The strangers outside had lost an icon, Dorothy, the Carnegie Hall concert, Over the Rainbow, the woman who could make you feel from the back row of a theater that she was singing directly to you. The three children walking through the front door had lost the woman whose slippers had pill bottles in them, who danced in the kitchen with her own records playing, who needed them to call the doctors, who loved them as fully as she was capable given everything that had been done to her and everything she was carrying. The Stonewall Uprising was occurring in those same days in that same New York neighborhood. The community that had adopted Garland as an icon was in the streets on June 27th and 28th while her children were in the funeral home. The timing was coincidental in every verifiable sense and resonant in every human one. By Liza's own later account, in interviews and in her memoir, a doctor prescribed her Valium ahead of the funeral to help her through the grief. She described crying for 8 straight days. She would identify this moment in a 1985 interview and again in recent years as the beginning of her own addiction. 23 years old, already genetically primed by her mother's pharmacology, handed the same drug class that had been managing Garland for 30 years during the most acute grief of her life. The inheritance she hadn't chosen arrived in a medical office, in a small white pill, in the worst month of her life. The Mirror. By the time she was 23 and receiving that Valium prescription in 1969, Liza Minnelli had already been a professional performer for years and had already won a Tony Award. In 1965, at 19 years old, she took Best Actress in a Musical for Flora the Red Menace, the youngest woman to win in that leading category at that time. The show had been written by John Kander and Fred Ebb, a songwriting partnership in its early years that would spend the next 30 years defining a particular strain of American musical theater. Flora was a genuine competitive win against established performers twice her age, for a production that existed entirely on its own terms, with no reflected light from her mother's name. She had grown up inside the entertainment industry in ways that carried no guarantee of success. Those 22 schools, the years in hotels and touring schedules, the caretaker role that absorbed her from age 13. She had spent her formative years watching 2 completely different models of what a career in this business looked like. Her mother's model, brilliant, consuming, chemically sustained, and structurally self-destructive. Her father's model, disciplined, critically acclaimed, financially stable, lasting decades in the same industry without burning anything down. She absorbed both. The career she built drew its heat from one and its architecture from the other. By 1972, director Bob Fosse was casting the film adaptation of Cabaret, set in Weimar, Berlin, as the Nazi Party methodically rises around a cabaret theater. The film's central character is Sally Bowles, a performer of genuine gifts and near total self-deception, a woman who sings and dances her way through an era that is collapsing around her, whose entire survival strategy is to stay in the spotlight and never look directly at what's accumulating in the dark. The role rewards someone who understands, at some physiological level, what it is to be brilliant and endangered simultaneously. Fosse knew Minnelli from Flora the Red Menace and from their broader professional circle. He knew what she could do. He cast her as Sally Bowles at 25 years old, and the result was what happens when the right part finds the right actor at exactly the right moment in their life. At the 45th Academy Awards ceremony on March 27, 1973, Liza Minnelli won Best Actress in a Leading Role for Cabaret, beating Diana Ross for Lady Sings the Blues and Cicely Tyson for Sounder, both of them nominated for roles that were themselves cultural landmarks of American cinema, both performances of the first order. Cabaret took 8 Oscars total that night. Liza was 27 years old and had built her way to that podium through a decade of professional work, the right creative partnership, and a role that happened to require precisely what her specific life had made her capable of delivering. The same calendar year produced a second major honor. Fosse had filmed Liza with a Z, a concert film shot at the Lyceum Theater in 1972, capturing her performing solo for a live audience, and it earned her the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Single Program in Variety and Popular Music in 1973. Two major competitive awards in a single year, for two different projects with the same director. She added a special Tony Award in 1974 for her contribution to the Broadway season with Liza at the Winter Garden. A second competitive Tony followed in 1978 for the act. The Grammy Legend Award, honorary rather than competitive, part of the inaugural year that category was issued, alongside Andrew Lloyd Webber, Smokey Robinson, and Willie Nelson, among others, came in 1990 and completed an EGOT at age 43. The Television Academy's own biographical record settles the question plainly. Winner of 4 Tony Awards, an Oscar, a Special Legends Grammy, 2 Golden Globe Awards, and an Emmy. These are real achievements built over real decades of genuine work. Karina Tomerly, writing for Civilian Global, captured something about watching Minnelli perform live that straight critical analysis couldn't quite contain. When she first saw Liza Minnelli in concert, the immediate thought was that this was Judy DNA right there. Tomerly meant it as a compliment to what Minnelli had independently constructed. It also contains the full weight of what this story is about. Every performance existed in 2 registers simultaneously: her own extraordinary achievement and an involuntary transmission from her mother that no amount of independent success could fully separate from the signal. Running parallel to every award and every curtain call, the addiction was compounding. By her own account, the Valium prescription of 1969 was the entry point. The dependency grew through the early 1970s into something that, according to one source reviewing her memoir, expanded progressively through benzodiazepines, barbiturates, amphetamines, and cocaine, at various points overlapping with treatment for physical pain and the ordinary chemical demands of a career that required performing at an extremely high level, continuously, for decades. She described it publicly as a genetic inheritance from her mother, something in the shared biology that responded to pressure, to grief, to the specific exhaustion of being enormously talented and enormously required, with the same chemical solution Garland had reached for under the same pressures. In July 1984, Liza entered the Betty Ford Clinic. The Daily Egyptian, reporting on July 17th of that year, noted she arrived accompanied by her physician and by Lorna Luft. The sister who had once sat beside their father at that kitchen table managing the doses was now sitting beside her sister at an addiction treatment center, decades later and on the other side of the same dynamic. All those weekly sessions at the kitchen table, all those capsules refilled with sugar, and the addiction had passed through the house like weather, finding whoever it was going to find. On June 19, 1985, Liza appeared on ABC's Good Morning America and told host David Hartman directly, "What really almost did me in was the Valium." She said it without self-pity or particular drama, naming the drug by name. In the same calendar year, her mother would have turned 63. The statement was both factual identification and implicit warning. The drug that had been prescribed to manage grief had become the instrument of a new crisis, and the pharmaceutical logic of it was exactly the same as her mother's. Sedatives to manage the stimulation of performance life, stimulants to manage the depression of the sedatives, the cycle reestablishing itself in the next generation with the same pharmacological grammar. There were subsequent treatments. She entered an undisclosed Midwestern facility in 2003, during a period when she described herself openly in the press as addicted to alcohol and painkillers. In March 2015, she was admitted to a recovery center in Malibu. She has stated in recent interviews that she has been sober for approximately 11 years, placing her last treatment around that 2015 admission. The arc spans roughly 46 years, from the first prescription in 1969 to the last documented treatment, with periods of sustained sobriety interspersed throughout. The same duration her mother struggled, measured in some of the same pharmaceutical language. Through all of it, she has refused to allow the tragedy to absorb everything. She describes dancing in the kitchen with her mother, Judy putting on her own records, playing while the rest of the household was quiet, just the two of them moving around each other in whatever hotel kitchen or home kitchen was available that week. She says she loved all of her. She acknowledges her parents didn't really like each other, and that the divorce was probably right for both of them, and in the same breath describes the complex affection of a childhood that was genuinely difficult and also genuinely full of love, and doesn't attempt to resolve the contradiction because it doesn't resolve. She and Lorna have both acknowledged, separately, that neither of them visits their mother's grave. The woman they loved isn't in a mausoleum in any meaningful sense. She's in the records playing in the kitchen, in the pharmaceutical legacy that both of her daughters have spent their adult lives wrestling into submission, and in the comparison that follows Liza onto every stage she has ever stood on, which is everywhere, and which has been her whole life. Lorna, the writer. Lorna Luft was 8 years old when she sat in Carnegie Hall on April 23, 1961, and watched her mother hold 2,800 people in a state of collective suspension for 2 solid hours. The sound in that hall, the audience recognizing the opening bars and responding before the first verse was finished, the layered noise of laughter and applause and spontaneous shouts from the back rows, wasn't something you witnessed from a seat and then described afterward. It went through you. Garland controlled that room the way some performers control a room, and the way most performers spend their entire careers wishing they could. Lorna watched it from the audience, and then had to be taken to a dressing room afterward to decompress, because the experience was that overwhelming. 2 years later, in 1963, at 11 years old, she sang Santa Claus is Coming to Town on the Judy Garland show's CBS Christmas episode, performing for her mother's national audience in her own professional debut. She entered the business on her mother's program, wearing her mother's audience, and then spent the next 6 decades building something that was genuinely and independently hers. The career across those decades was real and specific. Broadway debut in Promises, Promises, off-Broadway productions including Snoopy and Extremities, national tour of They're Playing Our Song, stage appearances in Gypsy, her first television acting role in 1973 on Love American Style, film work. She played Paulette in Grease 2 in 1982 and appeared in Where the Boys Are, 84. Recurring television work on Trapper John M.D., a sustained career as a cabaret performer with residencies at Feinstein's and touring dates across the country. Broadway opening night appearances documented as recently as 2024 and 2025, over 60 years after her first professional performance. People magazine described her as having inherited her mother's talent, and then named what else she'd inherited. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the family pattern found her. Cocaine and alcohol became serious problems, severe enough to require professional treatment. She reportedly went to the Betty Ford Center, the same facility where, in July 1984, she had accompanied Liza on Liza's own admission as support. The two sisters had orbited the same institutional address from different sides of the relationship. Caregiver 1 year, patient the next. Both of them circling the same gravitational center. She got sober. She has remained sober for decades. In March 2024, she was at a Drug Education Council luncheon, using her personal history as direct evidence. Fox 10 TV described her that year as someone who lost her mother to an overdose, overcame her own addiction, and now uses her testimony to show others that help exists and recovery is achievable. The act of public naming had begun earlier and more completely than anything she'd said from a podium. Me and My Shadows, a family memoir, was published by Simon & Schuster in 1998 and became a New York Times bestseller. The publisher's own description framed the subject with deliberate precision. A rare story of a little girl, her half-sister Liza, and her baby brother trying desperately to hang on to the mother whose life seemed destined to burn out. That is the careful marketing department version of what was inside the pages. Inside the pages, Lorna named specifically what she had lived. The pills cached in the hems of dresses and the toes of slippers, the weekly capsule refilling sessions with her father, the financial emergencies that arrived without warning, the role reversals, the 22 schools for her half-sister, the traveling, the ongoing management of a crisis that could never be permanently resolved. The Houston Chronicle used the word harrowing. Amazon's description called it the first gripping, factual account of the life and times of Judy Garland and her children. And the emphasis on factual was doing significant work in that sentence. To write that book, Lorna had to go back through every piece of family history she'd spent years not discussing publicly. The question that had followed her since before she was old enough to answer it, what's it like to be Dorothy's daughter, received its complete, documented answer in 1998. Not with bitterness, though there was basis for it. With the flat documentary precision of someone who had decided that what happened was real, that it mattered, and that other people who had lived through similar households needed someone to have said it first. The television adaptation, Life with Judy Garland, Me and My Shadows, won 5 Emmy Awards for director Robert Allen Ackerman, for writer Robert Friedman, and for actress Tammy Blanchard, who played Judy in the production. The private history Lorna had maintained for 3 decades was broadcast to audiences who had never heard of Lorna Luft, but recognized in it something specific and familiar from their own family histories. That recognition was the point. Children of addicted parents absorb early on that what happens at home is their family's specific secret. Shameful, private, not for outside consumption. A liability that becomes part of the operating software of how they present to the world. By publishing in 1998, by appearing on CNN's Larry King Live in 2001 to discuss it, by standing at Drug Education Council podiums in 2024, Lorna systematically dismantled that architecture of silence. The memoir was simultaneously personal processing and public service, and neither function cancels the other out. By 2001, she was discussing the book on national television. By 2024, she was in Mobile, Alabama, at a luncheon for addiction education, telling strangers that her mother died of an overdose and that she herself had been addicted and that she had been sober for decades, and that this is what the other side of it looks like. That progression, from the kitchen table to the luncheon podium, isn't an accident or a natural evolution. It's a deliberate choice, made repeatedly, to use the worst of what happened as evidence that survival is possible. Her personal life settled into something her mother never quite managed. 2 marriages, the second to Colin Freeman in 1996, 2 children, a career spanning 60-plus years with no sign of stopping. The contribution that will outlast the performances is the book and what it started. The insistence that the truth of what happened in that household is speakable, and that speaking it how you survive it. Joey, the Retreater. Here is what the confirmed public record of Joey Luft's adult life contains. Born March 29, 1955. Appeared as a child on The Judy Garland Show. performed at the Palace Theater on Broadway in 1967 alongside his mother and sisters. His name appears in the acknowledgments of his father Sidney's posthumously published memoir, Judy and I, credited alongside partners John Kimball, suggesting active involvement in bringing the book to publication after Sid's death in September 2005. Worked behind the scenes in entertainment, in photography, and sound editing. And then, in July 2014, at 59 years old, stood on stage at the Pasadena Playhouse. That is most of it. For the better part of 5 decades following his mother's death, Joey Luft maintained one of the most complete withdrawals from public visibility that a person born into that level of celebrity had ever sustained. No memoir, no television appearances to process the grief in real time, no interview circuit, no advocacy work, no public statements about what it was like to be 14 years old, sitting wherever 14-year-olds sit on a quiet Sunday morning in London or Los Angeles, or wherever he was on June 22, 1969, when the news arrived. He worked his industry job, attended events occasionally, appeared in family photographs when family occasions required it, and kept every interior dimension of the experience entirely private. This looks, from the outside, like silence. From the inside, it was probably the most deliberate, strategic choice any of the 3 children made. Watch what the public life did to his oldest sister, and the logic of Joey's retreat clarifies itself immediately. Liza Minnelli constructed one of the most genuinely distinguished careers in American entertainment history. 4 Tony Awards across 3 decades, an Oscar, an Emmy, an honorary Grammy, performances that filled Carnegie Hall on her own name, and still couldn't have a single profile written about her without the childhood arriving in the second paragraph. The celebrity machinery that consumed Garland's life had an appetite for Liza's relationship to her own story, too, requiring her to process her grief publicly, in real time, in interviews and profiles and award season retrospectives, for audiences that needed her to be Judy Garland's daughter first, and Liza Minnelli second. The spotlight she walked into was never entirely hers, regardless of what she put into it, or how independently she'd earned her place in it. Lorna went further in the other direction, making the private history public so completely that the family's internal record became a published book, a television miniseries, 5 Emmy Awards for the adaptation, an ongoing advocacy career built on repeating and extending the testimony. That work mattered, and continues to matter enormously. It also required decades of sustained public exposure, the memoir, the interviews, the book tours, the story retold to every journalist who asked, which was most of them. Joey watched both of his sisters from wherever he was. He made a different calculation. The Hollywood spotlight wasn't going to have his internal life. What had happened to his family was real, and it was his, and he wasn't required to make it content. He would do his work behind the cameras and stay out of the frame. What shifted in 2014 wasn't personal. It wasn't a breakdown or a therapy-prompted breakthrough or a family event that pushed him back toward the spotlight. It was a cultural observation about his mother's legacy that he found unacceptable. By 2014, Judy Garland's public image had calcified almost entirely around the tragic elements. To anyone under 40, the name suggested old Hollywood cautionary tale. Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, a figure exploited by the studio system, the pills, the 5 marriages, the debt, the death at 47 in a rented London bathroom. The Carnegie Hall concert existed on streaming services, but wasn't reaching new audiences in any meaningful way. The specific genius of what Garland had actually been, the timing, the phrasing, the ability to take a song apart and rebuild it in real time for a specific room on a specific night, the quality that made 2,800 people at Carnegie Hall respond to the first 4 bars of a song before the verse began, was being buried under the weight of the biography. The tragedy was consuming the work. In July 2014, Joey Luft debuted a Judy Garland concert with Joey Luft at the Pasadena Playhouse, a multimedia presentation running approximately 2 hours, built around Garland's recorded performances paired with his live storytelling. Not a eulogy, not a grief exercise, not an account of what it cost to be her son, but a direct encounter with her craft, offered specifically to people who had been given only the tragic version of who she was. The show toured. It played the Camelot Theater in Mesa, Arizona on October 18, 2014, and continued to other venues across the country. An AZ Central interview, published October 13, 2014, captured his stated purpose in a single sentence. "There's a whole generation we'd like to reach." Not, "Here is what I carried for 45 years. Not, "This is what it cost me personally." There's a whole generation we'd like to reach, implying that Garland herself is still an active party in the reaching, not a figure requiring explanation, but a performer requiring an audience. The "we" in that sentence is doing something important. Joey was presenting the show not as a son processing his history, but as a collaborator completing a job that had been left unfinished, getting Judy Garland's actual work in front of people who'd never had the chance to encounter it properly. The interviews surrounding the show contain almost nothing personal. He didn't explain the preceding 45 years of silence. He didn't discuss his own grief, his own processing, his own relationship to the name he had carried since birth. What he offered was the show. Her talent, her genius, the recordings, his stories about who she actually was in the room. And when asked about his father, he gave People magazine exactly this: "My dad loved her. He wanted to protect her." 2 sentences. No score settling, no complexity about the pill swapping or the enabling, or the memoir Sid never finished. He loved her and wanted to protect her. True, incomplete, and offered exactly as stated. A Palm Springs Life reviewer who attended the Camelot Theater performance wrote that for nearly 2 hours, Garland's star was reborn through her son's presentation. Not preserved, not mourned. Reborn, which is a different thing entirely, requiring the active participation of audiences who had never seen her and were now, through a 2-hour multimedia show in a Mesa, Arizona theater, encountering what all the fuss had actually been about. Joey Luft watched his oldest sister build the mirror of his mother's career and pay the price the mirror extracted. He watched his middle sister write the testimony and carry it on public tour for decades. He spent 45 years figuring out which role was his. When he found it, at 59 years old in Pasadena, the role turned out to be the simplest one available. The one person in the family who would stand up specifically and only to argue for his mother's genius, not to narrate his own survival. His sisters had earned the right to make their survival public. He had earned the right to keep his private. And when he finally spoke, after half a century of deliberate silence, what he chose to say was, "Let me show you what you've been missing." Judy Garland said in interviews across her career, "I've always taken the Wizard of Oz very seriously, you know. I believe in the idea of the rainbow, and I've spent my entire life trying to get over it." She wasn't being metaphorical about the song or ironic about the film. She meant she had spent decades trying to escape being reduced entirely to one image, the 16-year-old in the blue gingham dress, shot through with amphetamines, told the image she projected was the most valuable thing about her. She never entirely managed it. The icon consumed the woman. Her children inherited that problem in its most intimate form. Not a symbol or a cultural touchstone, but a woman whose slippers contained pill bottles, who danced in the kitchen with her own records playing, who needed them to call the doctors, who loved them as fully as she was capable, and who died at 47 in a small rented bathroom in London, having been one of the most famous people alive for the better part of 30 years, and having never quite gotten free. Each of them answered that inheritance with the only instrument available, their own specific character. Liza had Vincente Minnelli's discipline and Garland's incandescence, and she built something with both of them: 4 Tony Awards, an Oscar, an Emmy, a Grammy Legend Award, and paid the full price of the incandescence in prescription pills and alcohol and multiple decades of treatment, in a recovery that is held, by her own account, for approximately 11 years. Lorna had the clarity that comes from being the one who actually sat at the kitchen table and understood the machinery from inside, who decided in 1998 that the only thing left to do was name what had happened, and who has spent the years since standing in public spaces with medical organizations saying, "This is real, and here is what the other side of it looks like." Joey had the same inheritance, and the intelligence to recognize, watching what the spotlight did when combined with it, that the most self-preserving choice available was to stay out of the frame until he had something specific to say, and that when he finally had something specific to say, it wouldn't be about himself at all. 3 responses to the same wound: the same mother, the same household, the same love, the same impossible weight. Liza built the mirror. Lorna wrote the testimony. Joey protected the genius and waited for 45 years until the moment was right to share it. Subscribe for more stories like this.